coaching relationships that start to falter after 4 sessions or so because those core foundational pieces were not there.
Today, I'm excited to be joined by Master Certified Executive Coach Teresa Pool, and we are lucky to have her as an executive coach with Stewart Leadership as well. So welcome, Teresa.
Thank you. I'm also excited to be here. One of my favorite things to do is talk about coaching.
Okay, now on to today's topic, the secrets of great coaching. All right, Teresa, what is it about coaching that gets so much attention these days? It seems to be a constant topic and an important one. What can coaching do that's so powerful for us?
Well, I think first need to recognize this has been a low and slow groundswell that is really picking up speed in the last 10 years, since 1995. And I think it's all due to the fact that coaching works. You know, many modalities come and go, but coaching has proven itself to have a really strong return on investment for individuals and companies. So I think that's what keeps it going and keeps it rolling.
Let me put up a slide here and we can speak to this. This comes from the International Coaching Federation. As we look at a lot of overall impact, 5 to 7 times the ROI, and all of the many different ways that coaching can have a positive impact. As you're looking at this, Teresa, comment on a few of these that you see so often as you work with other coaches and clients.
Wow, that is almost a big Pandora's box there to open it up like that. I think the first thing I'll mention is that there are more than just these, right? These are just some. They are maybe the common some, but there are many other ways to have impact on coaching. What lies underneath all of these is that when you change the mindset of the executive, of the leader, it has an impact on all these areas. You know, consulting goes directly, it was a marvelous venue as well, right? You know, consulting really works to engage workforce environments, teams become aligned, but where coaching can have an impact is it is working on the mindset. It's working on the cognitive shift in leaders so that they are able to create these things. So I think one of the most common in the executive work that I'm often engaged in with Stewart Leadership is a lot of this about assimilation, preparing leaders for succession, surviving in promotions. The communication strategy is something that I often see, you know, how people communicate in one role, how they engage the workforce in a role, how they support change in a role shifts as they move up the ladder or into a new position. And so a lot of these coaching can really help someone who's already perhaps good at these things in one previous venue or role. In a new environment or a new role, these things need to shift. Like it's that old thing, what got you here won't get you there. I think blind spots are also, it's almost like it's a cornerstone of coaching. Coaches hold up the mirror to what we're observing in a supportive and challenging way to help people recognize what they can't see, what they don't know, and how that might be impacting their leadership.
That's well said. And I'd love to get some initial comments from all of the listeners here. As folks are looking at this list, or if they're just listening, I'll read off a few. I'd love to hear or have everybody on the call here, one statement that they write in terms of an impact that either they've experienced or would want to experience from coaching. Write in just that one statement in the Q&A feature here as you then think about what is an impact. Could it be in identifying a blind spot? Or could it be in a communication strategy or influencing approach, or maybe to build a common culture? Could it be to align your team in different ways, or to understand the political nature, or to improve performance, to engage your workforce? So many different aspects of coaching, and would love to hear from each of you out there as you're thinking about, maybe you've been in a coaching situation or you're about to go into one. What is it that you would want to experience? And as we're beginning to see this, Teresa, what would you say one of the top one or two things you often hear that people want out of coaching?
Wow, it's so unique to every individual. I'm trying to think of what are those common themes. I think they want to be a better leader, but they're not quite sure what that means or what it needs to look like. I think that's the big part of it, is they want to be better, but better is such a nebulous term that they're not really clear on what is the path to better. What do I really need in order to be better? And I think we're starting to see that in some of the comments that are, coming up. For some people it's blind spots. For some it's about being more consistent. For some it's about influencing, political savvy. Look how different all those responses are, right? And I think that's what we see in coaching, that there's no one common thread that we focus on. And that's what makes coaching such a unique field, is that every person brings different needs, different context, different culture, different everything to the table. And that requires the coach to be a bit of a chameleon to adapt to whatever the clients are needing in that space. I don't know if that really answers your question, Daniel, in the where you were going with this, but it's hard to find that single common theme other than I know I need to change and I'm not sure exactly where or how, or maybe I know where, but don't know how.
Yeah, that's well put. And what also is coming out from your comments, and so many of the comments that are being listed here as well, is that this is such a personal, individual development approach. And so often in any sort of development solution idea, the more personalized it is to the individual, the more connected with them, it then can increase that likelihood of success even more.
I love this comment that Patrick's made. My favorite coaching statement is, a leopard can't change its stripes. Very priceless. Yeah.
So cool. So it definitely is something about, there is a need, a desire to be able to then grow and develop. And we'll touch upon this because that is such a fundamental success factor, frankly, to be able to ensuring coaching can be successful and to achieve many of these potential impacts, for sure.
I think that's why we spend so much time early in the engagement getting real clarity on what the client wants to work on, getting it from that nebulous, I want to be better space, I want to change something space, into more specifics. And those specifics might morph and change throughout the program, but having that clear compass point that we're moving towards is so incredibly important. And again, as you said, unique to each client.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. I want us to talk for a moment around these roles, the roles that exist within the coaching situation. It's all about people, yes, developing people. So we have a coach, it could be internal, external. We have a coachee, and then we have an organization, stakeholders, HR, the person's boss, something else. Talk to me, Teresa, in terms of what are the roles of these different, responsibilities, functions of these different roles here to make sure that coaching is successful?
Well, that is a really critical point too, because without getting role clarity amongst all those people in the very beginning, coaching can go south pretty quick. Right? Because coaching needs to be a true relationship between the coach and the client. There needs to be a significant level of confidentiality to create a safe and fertile place, a productive place to make the change happen. So one of the things that I think is important is that if we look, I'll just kind of walk through the roles, right? So the role for the client is really the client does the work. And we want the client from the beginning to recognize that this is not a consulting, mentoring, or training, which they might already be used to. Many people that haven't had coaching before, they have expectations. And so part of the coach's role in the beginning is to get real clarity on what is the client's responsibility here, because change, isn't very effective from the outside. And so when the client starts to own and have full accountability for that, knowing that they are responsible for what they're working on, doing the work in between sessions, coming prepared to the sessions, then that gets everything off to a strong footing. The coach's role is really about being an expert in the coaching toolkit, right? This toolkit is defined by the International Coaching Federation. We have very specific competencies that we follow. And so My expertise is in those things, which means I don't have to be an expert in your industry, your job, your role, your level. I am an expert in those tools, and those tools can be applied across all those things. And so the person then begins to understand that my job is to kind of ask some hard and challenging yet supportive questions, to make observations about maybe some things I'm noticing, like those blind spots we talked about earlier. And to providing the client with that safe space to really start exploring. So there's some challenge and support that come together as part of what I'm creating in that space. My job to create that fertile space. The stakeholders all have different roles too. Sometimes the leader that I'm coaching, their leader might want to be involved in goal setting. That can be very appropriate. So we might have like a little triad where the three of us will meet and we'll talk about what are the goals that are both valuable to the person being coached, the executive leader, and their leader, or maybe another stakeholder like HR stepping in for that role as well. Could be any of those things. And so there we're all clear up front about what we're working on. And then sometimes there are other stakeholders. Those might be customers, they might be direct reports, they might be peers. And we often engage them through a 360 or interview, some way to kind of gather their input on what they need to see from this person in terms of change. And so that can be an important part of data gathering. We also want to make sure that the other stakeholders, especially whether it's leadership development, HR, or the leader's leader, about what that confidentiality really means. There aren't going to be detailed reports about what we worked on from the coach. If you need those, the best person to get that from is the person being coached, so that that safe and confidential space is maintained. And so that setting that expectation up front is helpful. And then finally, I'll say that if there is a lot of engagement from the leader's leader, is for them to provide feedback along the way as well. What are they seeing that's working? What are they noticing that's different? Where do they see, if there's something they've seen that they aren't giving feedback on that probably should be, right? That there's a behavior issue or challenge. We want them to have accountability for their role in coaching success, and sharing that is also important.
As you're going through all of this, I'm curious for all of the listeners here, I wonder what roles people have who are listening.
Mm-hmm.
And so for everyone who's listening, if you could please in the Q&A, identify, are you going to be coached, or are you being coached? Are you a coachee? Or are you a coach, either internal or external? Or are you a stakeholder in the organization who might bring in a coach or have oversight to help support that process? As you're hearing this, and frankly, you might be multiple. Great. List any of those roles out. We'd love to see who is on the call. What is the mindset? We're already beginning to see both the coach and the coachee. Executive coach, stakeholder and coach, coach external, and we just continue on. Please keep them coming. Coach at mid-level, coach and coachee. So many folks have multiple hats. And so, Teresa, talk about then being clear on what your role is, because sometimes you might actually have different hats depending upon the situation.
Make sure I understand the question. So is this for my role wearing a coach's hat and how my hat changes, or are we talking about these other stakeholders and how their hats may change?
I guess the real point is, how do we help ourselves be clear about the roles, especially when we may have different situations where we might be different roles in them, and we need to be clear to how we switch and how we show up.
Okay, so if I am, for example, one interesting switch I'll talk about, and I don't know if this applies to anyone, for the internal coaches, they're expected to wear multiple hats, and they are sometimes in the hat of mentor, trainer, facilitator, intervention. That may be their roles. And then all of a sudden they're expected to change onto a coaching hat, set those roles aside, and create a confidential, productive environment for coaching to occur. And so that is one of the more challenging multiple hat roles to wear, is that of the internal coach, because they are expected to do all these roles in a very different way. They also have an expectation of reporting that is often different. The external coach can say, as an external coach, I don't provide reporting because that breaks the bounds of confidentiality and breaks trust and keeps us from having a really fertile space. But the internal coach, because they're owned by the organization, they set those expectations. That's much harder to push back on. So that's probably one that I would say is the most. Maybe one of the others that can have a really big impact is the role of the leader of the person being coached, because they're also wearing multiple hats, right? They have their responsibility for outcomes hat, their responsibility for performance hat, while also being that in that supportive place of allowing coaching to unfold, take the time it needs to for behavior changes to occur, providing good feedback along the way that I've already mentioned. So they wear a couple of multiple roles and hats as well.
That's a powerful one, to be able to then understand who you are, what role you're fulfilling, and to keep in mind, especially the confidentiality element, what that means based upon the role you have to show up and create that optimal coaching experience. And one of the ways that I think can help enable that to happen well is to have a clear process within the coaching experience. Let me share this slide here to be able to then talk through, and would love your thoughts, Teresa. What is a good coaching process to be able to then keep things moving and to be clear about the roles while enabling progress to happen? How would you kind of describe that process?
Wow, that's a very good point. There is a process, and it is also the coach's role to manage the process without it feeling too much like a forced process, right? And adapting the process to the client, to the organization, and what they need. So there's some flexibility within the process that fits what the needs of the individual and the organization. But all engagements start with this discovery process. Sometimes, depending on the organization, the executive is given free rein. Here's your coach. Maybe it's a reward, or you're new to role. Just do what you're with your coach, and the stakeholders aren't even involved. Sometimes that's the case, but many of the times, this discovery phase is going to involve goal setting that includes some or all of the stakeholders, and getting really clear, as I had mentioned before, about what is the target that we're going after. Notice that word expectation setting, right? This is where we set the expectations for confidentiality, roles, all those things. So everyone in play understands what role they play in making for successful coaching. And so that is the beginning of the discovery phase. Part of that discovery, kind of 1 and 2 can overlap, because this is where we start gathering data. So early on in the process, we are gathering data, typically through different kinds of assessments. They might include a 360. You may be gathering some personal and professional information about the client, getting to know them better. And this can also feed the goals and adjust and adapt the goals, right? So the original goals might be further informed by a 360, for example, or by input from the leader. And so then the goals then start to get more formalized and firm as we move through that second assessment and data gathering phase. And then action planning is something that also is occurring almost in parallel with the development phase. And we'll talk about that in a second. We start with those focus areas, but we aren't always clear on exactly what needs to happen. We don't want to begin with actions. We want to begin with the goal and the target. And then as we are coaching the development sessions, 1 to 2 sessions each month, those actions become more and more clear. So this action plan is a very fluid document that moves us more and more into what are the behaviors that will begin to shift. Coaching itself is this blend between mindset and cognitive change, right? We have to think differently to act and do differently. And then the actions, the do and different actions that come out of that. And so those things kind of work in tandem, the action planning and the ongoing coaching via development that's occurring. And then about number 5 actually will occur sometimes midpoint and again at the end, where we are taking a look at progress. This may or may not include the boss and stakeholders, depending on how the engagement is set up. But we will talk about, well, here are the goals that we're working on. And sometimes the coach will facilitate this process versus contribute data, right? Because we're still in confidentiality, but we're facilitating a conversation midway and again at the end about, here are the changes we were going for. What have you noticed? What have you seen? What's left to do? And what can we celebrate? And then that always occurs at the end as well in the engagement. And that way we know and we can determine a bit of, has this been worth the client's investment of time and energy? Because they're an executive, right? Time, energy, and money for an executive is critical. This has to be worth their effort. And we get that feedback as well. And I would say probably the majority of the time, especially if the client has done their work, the answer is always, oh yes, and let's do some more.
That's great, Sonia. I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. As you've gone through this, I've often thought of there are two work streams happening during the coaching process. One work stream tends to be kind of the overarching set of goals, one or two or three overarching themes, general objectives, and then further defining the actions that need to happen. The other work stream seems to be session to session stuff that comes up that, yes, it can relate to the larger goals, but sometimes it's, hey, can you help me think through this? Can you help? Teresa, how do you kind of manage those two work streams that seem to keep popping up and that are needed, that are important, ongoing work?
Well, that's a very interesting point. The ICF has recognized this, and they actually have built that into the skill set. And it's called the engagement agreement, right? Versus the session agreements. And the one way the coach can facilitate that process is when the client, let's say we're working on preparing for a promotion, right? We're on the succession path. We're maybe one of 12 executives on the succession path for the next level of role. Maybe might be in a leadership training plan in our company. And so they have some very specific goals on what it takes to be ready for that next level. And that's the engagement agreement that we have. And those are the engagement goals that we've established with success measures. And then they show up and say, I'm getting ready I've been tagged to do a board presentation. And I have a tendency to get very tactical in my presentations and give way too much data. My boss has already warned me that will not work at the board level. And so we spend the whole session kind of exploring that and discussing it and coming up with alternative plans. But then the coach then will always tag. So what will this do to forward you towards the engagement goal that we have about preparing for promotion? How will this prepare you for that next big step? And that really makes it important, right? That raises the importance of this, what seemingly feels like a rabbit trail for today. We really make that tie and then always kind of put those back together.
Oh, this is cool. Okay, so I'm gonna keep asking lots of questions, but everybody who's listening, please, at this point, type in questions that you may have around specific coaching engagements, confidentiality. We're not diving into, no. But in terms of process, in terms of what can be done to access and ensure coaching success, please keep the questions coming and we'll be able to then reference that. And something you were saying, Teresa, I often will think of the metaphor of jazz. Jazz is so often spontaneous. And I often will think of a coaching conversation as it is a bit of like jazz, because as a coach, you need to have enough understanding of the basics and the process, but you need to be able to be flexible in the moment of where you're going to go while still having a general idea of the overall rhythm and how do we connect this? How do you see that playing out in terms of benefiting and creating a great coaching experience? Yeah. And even there, you were beginning to go through so many different topics that could be addressed in coaching. Run through a few more. What have been some of topics that have come out that you've been engaged with coaching clients on? What sorts of things are the focus areas?
One big one, and I said I do a lot of work with, preparations for promotion and assimilation, or barriers to promotion, right? We get that sometimes too. But one of the things that comes up time and time again is that I call it the what got you here won't get you there model, which is I'm an excellent tactician. I know how to execute on a plan. I know how to lead teams to execute on a plan. I can be incredibly tactical and I can get the job done. And then I'm migrating or have migrated into a job that requires me to think and be strategic. I don't even know how to run a calendar that isn't packed. If my calendar is packed, if my email is packed, there is no time to be strategic. There is no brain space to be strategic, right? And so if I am working all the time and I am running on empty, then that keeps me from being the powerful, strategic, compelling leader who knows how to influence people versus direct people, right? Because certain levels move from the power is in being able to direct because you have direct control to being able to influence because you don't control anybody. You don't control your peers. You don't control external vendors. You don't control your boss, your boss's peers. And so all of those things require you to have this whole new mindset around tactical to strategic leap and shift. That's a big one. I get that one a lot. And they're and if you think about, for example, a CFO role, there are tactical CFOs and there are strategic CFOs. And those are both very different roles. And sometimes one has to move into the other in order to grow their career. And yet that is a shock to them, right? To be able to move from point A to point B, or they don't know how. They want to do it, but don't know how.
Right.
That's one.
So everything from leadership development to career development to transition and onboarding, executive presence, strategic thinking. Yes, 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 yes. Any of these elements to really help somebody embrace what they need to do now, as well as in the future to be successful. There's several great questions coming in. Here's one that I hear a lot, and I'm guessing you do as well. How do you monitor performance to determine if the coaching was successful? Especially because this confidentiality element, which is so powerful, yes, and yet there's inevitably a need, the HR person or the boss or the CEO saying, how do I know this is being successful? What are some good ways of addressing that?
Well, I think the first answer is I can't, right? I can't. I open a little window twice a month and we have an amazing conversation with a lot of challenge and a lot of homework and all these things that go on. I cannot determine if they're taking that out into the workplace and changing. This is why in the very beginning, when we are setting expectations, that the stakeholders are also part of the observing team. And the leader also, we've helped them get a lot of clarity about how will you know you've changed? And we tap into that right through. So the only way I know is I get feedback from the leader, which can only go so far. And perhaps then we get feedback midpoint and endpoint from the others. That's what's so hard for organizations. Coaching is like throwing money into a black hole. But and they don't know where I need to know how my money's being spent. And so we cover that up front to go, this is behavioral. Here are the behaviors we're looking to change. Here's how you can observe those. And we're expecting you to give feedback. And we're expecting your leader to give feedback. A 360 at the beginning and end, like framing a 360 will also deliver how is the performance being monitored. Are things, so the one way that I determine if the coaching engagement has the capability of success, and that is different. And that is the person is showing up engaged every time. They have learned about the third or fourth session, how I can make this work. I can bring this to the table and that to the table. They craft field work that is truly challenging for themselves along those lines. And they bring back having either completed it or having issues with it, but they learn from what happened. And so they're really engaged in the process and you can hear it. Right now I'm doing an example engagement with that same tactical to strategic CFO. The types of things, and we're now on our second 6-month engagement, and the types of things that are showing up at the coaching table from the second 6 months is very different because he was still leaning into those tactical things. And now we're talking about acquisitions, we're talking about 3-year strategic plans. His whole mindset, you can tell, has shifted. So that is one way. And he's getting feedback and asking for feedback from his leader, and how his leader is starting to engage him more, how the board is starting to reach out when they have a question about something that's very strategic. And so those are markers, but again, it is not for me. I cannot be the determinator for that because I only see the client, right? But I can put things into place to help others monitor it, and for the person to recognize their own progress, which I think is very powerful.
This really gets at the coachee taking responsibility, being open and diving in versus being kind of a passive player in this process. So talk a little bit more in terms of, for the coachee themselves, what do they need to have in order to make coaching successful? So this black box of tossing money in and investing is not such a risk, but rather we have very clear understanding of how to make sure this is successful. What does the coachee need to do?
So I think the coachee, and this is something that I always, in that very step one in the discovery phase, we always do, is make sure coaching is not coerced. Forced coaching is a big waste of money. I've learned this the hard way. I used to do recovery coaching, in the executives that had, horrible damaging behaviors that caused them to go to, HR and get write-ups and court dates and things like that, right? It just doesn't work very well. It's not it can work, but the efficacy is really low, like less than 40%. So one thing we can do to even begin that is pick the right people, the people that want this, the people that are motivated to change, the people that have some clear ideas of how they'd like to apply coaching, or the fact that they really would want some change in their leadership. They recognize that up front. So some of that early awareness and desire to change. I love the ones that are lifelong learners. They may not even know what they want to coach on, but they're excited to try something new, right? Those are wonderful clients to have. So just that initial setup can help us in the early days set this thing up for success. I think that's part of it. And then the rest is to having those clear desired success measured outcomes that other people can see. I often say the first half, especially the typical 6-month engagement, right? 12 sessions, 6 months. The first 3 months, it's like everything's under the surface, right? The person is mentally changing, their mindset's changing, they might be experimenting with a few new behaviors, but it's not obvious out yet. But then that second half is when others start to notice. I had one CEO pick up the phone and say, "I have to ask, did you put our CIO on drugs?" He was serious. I'm like, no, that's not my job. He's like, he's just this changed person. He doesn't lose his temper in meetings anymore. He's very curious. He's asking questions. He's becoming more coach-like. And so that's a extreme example, but they start noticing that more in that second half. And that's when they start providing. I said, well, who needs this feedback? It's not me. The feedback needs to go to the person being coached. So let me stop there and make sure I'm not going on a tangent. Am I heading in the right direction with that question, Daniel?
That's fantastic. Very much so. And in fact, you're reminding me, especially that few months in the beginning where others may not see necessarily an impact visibly.
Right.
But then after that, they will likely see more of it. In some ways, I think that speaks to the cognitive work that is happening and then the behavior. Talk a little bit about that sequence, because it's key to understand the cognitive mindset,
Yes.
the blind spots, the self-limiting beliefs, all of that, and then the behaviors instead of right in the behaviors. Anyway, talk to me in terms of the balancing of that.
I'll use a diet metaphor, right? We're getting ready. We are going into swim season, right? So I use the diet metaphor. And it's like, how many times have we tried to go on a diet with behaviors? I'm gonna do these behaviors, and this time it's gonna work. And it just doesn't stick very much. But yet if you just spend months working on the inside, right? The mindset about what is creating the recurring cycle, being very clear on what are the beliefs going on, what are the behaviors that have been getting in my way. By exploring all of that, you start to change the inside so that then the external behaviors can work. Now, this doesn't mean that we only do cognitive in the beginning and only actions at the end. We don't. right? They're blended together, but more work is being done by the client on the inside, typically in this very beginning. And then they use these action experiments to put that into practice on the outside. But it doesn't, and then so through those experimentations of new behaviors, they start a feedback loop. And that feedback loop changes the way our brain literally is structured. It adds neurology, it changes neurology. Because they, I mean, like the leader I mentioned earlier when they asked about the drugs, he's like, he literally told me, I did not know that you could get someone to do a better job other than yelling at them. That's what I thought had to happen. That's what I thought you were supposed to do as a CIO. You were supposed to yell at people to get their behavior to change. It was a totally new experience for him. So he tried it. He's like, it really worked, Yeah, and nobody called HR afterwards either. And so, those are some examples of the early experimentation. Then that last half, you've got this more, and I'm not saying it's still set in wet cement in the second half, but they're starting to, it becomes natural, right? It becomes the natural behavior. If you learn a new sport, and in the beginning, pickleball feels really strange, and then after a while, it's some of the things start becoming more natural, and that's what happens in that second half of the engagement. So,
oh, I love it. I love it. So well put. As I'm looking at some of these questions, we'll try to get to as many as we can. There's a question that's been asked, Teresa, around managing multiple coaches within an organization to be able to ensure that there's a level of consistency and that the coachees are not getting mixed messages in some way. And I hear this, and part of it is balancing the consistency while still offering the individual coaching. Yeah, the flexibility. Talk to me in terms of that balancing act, especially with multiple coaches in an organization.
Can you bring up our slide again that has the 5-step process? And I'll refer to
yes, of course.
Because that's where you'll see where the distinction becomes between consistency and flexibility. So the discovery phase can be very consistent. The process by which different coaches work in an organization and how they go about, maybe it's 3-way discovery. Everyone is going to do the 3-way discovery. There may be certain ways that we document goals on a consistent form or format, a consistent approach with doing that. So the discovery phase will have very specific and consistent approach, and it should, because that's what people are expecting. The assessment phase. Now, sometimes different people need different types of assessments, but the pool of assessments should be small and common, because what we don't want is someone to go, wow, I took this assessment, it was really cool. Oh, I didn't get one of those, right? And so there's those conversations about, these are the different assessments we have. In your situation, I'm recommending this, so that they understand why they might be different from someone else, or we just use the same one for everybody. That can be done too. That's just what we do. Action planning is the same kind of thing, where we might use consistent forms and formats, but because it's kind of woven into the development phase, that development phase is where flexibility really starts showing up. What does this client need? What are they bringing to the table? What are their challenges? What are their strengths, their beliefs, their mindsets? That's where it's going to be unique. But the frequency of sessions can be consistent, right? We can make, okay, everyone's going to get 2 a month, for example. The sessions are all 50 minutes, for example. They're all going to be on Zoom, for example. Those kind of aspects can be kept very consistent. And then the final results piece kind of is that bookend with the discovery piece. It can also be consistent in the way we approach that.
That's great. So really it's the process elements, key process elements that can have it consistent while still honoring the flexibility and confidentiality within each space. There's another question here, and I don't know if I understand it exactly, so I'm going to take a stab at it here, which really gets at the internal voice and the external voice.
I know exactly what that question is.
Please, yes, share.
Patrick, I have a lot of students in the executive coaching training program that struggle with this inside voice, the internal coach, with the external voice, the internal external coach consultant. And what happens is we're rewarded as an identity of our role with how much expertise we can bring to the table, right? And so it is an identity shift as a coach to go from I am measuring my ability, capability, my success as a coach, consultant, I call them, which is a very valuable role. Nothing wrong with it, right? There's nothing wrong with wearing both hats, depending on the organization and the client. I never want to judge that. But if your goal is to be truly just a pure coach in certain scenarios, then it's that identity that says, I'm good because, or maybe I'm driven to help. Maybe I have a really strong need to help, and I don't like to see people struggle. And yet it's the struggle of the process that creates change, like helping the butterfly out of their cocoon, and then they never fly because they didn't have to struggle to get out of their cocoon. So it's about taking a look at why, thinking of your own internal why, that internal voice, that inside voice that's telling me this is how I am successful, and taking a look at that and going, how can I shift that to being successful based upon what are good coaching skills versus my clients' outcomes? Because when we get attached to our clients' outcomes versus measuring our success by our skills, then that attachment causes us to put on a different hat. So I would love to know, Patrick, because it's a short question and I want to make sure, because yes, it's all of those things. I would love to make sure we've answered that in a way that is working for you. If there's something, an add-on to that would be helpful.
Please, that's great. And as Patrick or others are offering additional questions, we have a few more minutes here. And frankly, I want to ask you, Teresa. So here's maybe a simple but a challenging question. What's the number one thing? What's the number one thing that will help ensure a successful coaching experience? What would you say to that question?
That's like saying, what is the one thing that makes a partnership or a marriage work? Is there one thing? I'm not sure there can be one thing. However, I will say what will prevent it from working. How about that? A barrier that can get in the way. And that is, and this is why I think it's so important that everyone interview at least 2 or 3 coaches, because the relationship, the connection, the rapport, if that is not there, or confidentiality is not there to contain that, we call it the coaching container. If that container isn't strong, that there is a good rapport, that the coach and client have the ability to challenge each other, to have hard conversations. If that is not there, then the engagement cannot be successful. So I'm looking at it from the glass half full perspective versus our glass half empty perspective instead.
Right. Yeah. In other words, what I'm hearing from you, and I'm seeing some comments here that reinforce it, is that that connection, that trust between the coach and the coachee, and do I even go so far as to say this level of learning and openness? You got to want it.
Yes.
You got to want to be able to then challenge yourself to be able to learn and progress and acknowledge and shape differently. Is that a way of kind of putting it as well?
It is. And that's why that discovery phase and the expectation and roles discussion is so incredibly important. Because if that is not done, I see over and over coaching relationships that start to falter after 4 sessions or so, because those core foundational pieces were not there. And that's why powerful. Internal coaching is so tough. They don't always have the flexibility to have and create that safe container because of the expectations of the internal coach.
Yeah, love it. We want to honor and give people a few minutes as they're going between meeting to meeting, as always, to encourage some good wellness practices. So we may not have gotten to all of your questions. Please feel free to shoot me or Teresa an email, daniel@stewartleadership.com or teresa@stewartleadership.com, to offer any additional questions or comments. We'd love to help support you. Teresa, thank you for being part of the Leadership Growth Hour.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. It was fun. It went really fast.
This is great. For our listeners, please note that our next monthly Leadership Growth Hour will be on July 12th at noon Central Time, and when we'll be talking about shifting from burnout to belonging. with guest executive consultant Tim Davison. That'll be a great conversation. And to register for future Leadership Growth Hour events, please visit stewartleadership.com/events. We'd love to have you join us. All the best. Take care, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.